There is an island in Japan where the trees are dying, not from disease, not from drought, not from pollution. The soil is healthy, the rain still comes, the climate hasn't changed. But walk through the forests of Hokkaido today, and something feels wrong. The undergrowth is stripped bare. Riverbanks are crumbling into the water. Saplings never reach 2 feet before they disappear. Scientists noticed it first in the data, a slow, quiet unraveling that started not last year, not a decade ago, but more than a century in the making. And when they traced it back, when they followed the thread all the way to the beginning, they didn't find a disease. They didn't find a chemical. They didn't find a natural disaster. They found a decision, a government decision, made by men who thought they were protecting something, men who believed they were making the island safer. And in one sense, they succeeded. The threat they were afraid of, gone, completely gone. But what came after, what filled that silence, was something nobody predicted, something that would take decades to surface, something invisible until it was almost too late. The wolves of Hokkaido didn't just disappear. They took the forest with them. Hokkaido is Japan's northernmost island, cold, vast, largely untamed. For thousands of years, it was covered in dense forest, birch, oak, and fir stretching across mountains that most people never set foot on. And inside those forests, at the top of the food chain, was the Ezo wolf. Not a myth, not a legend, a real animal, larger than the wolves found on the Japanese mainland, adapted to Hokkaido's brutal winter, built for this landscape in a way nothing else on the island was. The Ainu people, Hokkaido's indigenous population, had lived alongside the Ezo wolf for centuries. They called it Horkyu Kamui, the divine hunting dog. They didn't worship it out of superstition. They understood something that would take scientists another 150 years to put into words. The wolf kept everything in balance. But in the 1870s, Japan changed. The Meiji government opened Hokkaido to large-scale farming. Foreign agricultural advisors were brought in, many from the United States, and they brought their fears with them. Wolves near livestock meant one thing to these men: loss. So the government acted. They introduced strychnine-laced bait across the island's interior. Systematic, deliberate, effective. By 1889, the last confirmed Ezo wolf was dead. The ranchers celebrated. The government called it progress. And for a long while, nothing seemed wrong. The forests were still standing. The rivers still ran clear. The deer still moved through the trees the way they always had. But the deer were different now, and nobody noticed. Without the wolf, the deer had no predator, nothing to fear, nothing to run from, nothing to tell them where they couldn't go. In the years after the Ezo wolf disappeared, the Sika deer population on Hokkaido didn't just grow, it exploded. Slowly at first, quietly, the kind of growth that doesn't look like a problem until it suddenly does. Farmers noticed more deer near the fields. Hunters reported easier tracking. Some thought it was good news. More deer meant more game. More game meant more food. Nobody was asking the question that actually mattered. What were the deer eating? Because Sika deer don't just graze. They strip. They eat bark off young trees. They graze riverbank vegetation down to the soil. They return to the same patches of forest again and again and again because nothing moves them on. A wolf doesn't just kill deer. It changes how deer move. It forces them to keep shifting, never staying in one place long enough to cause permanent damage. Ecologists call it the landscape of fear. The threat of a predator shapes the behavior of prey even when no attack occurred. But that landscape was gone now, and the deer knew it, not consciously, but in the way animals always know. They slowed down. They settled. They ate. Decade after decade after decade. The damage was happening in slow motion, too slow for any one person to witness across a single lifetime. It wasn't until researchers began comparing old survey maps with new ones that something stopped them cold. The tree line on certain parts of Hokkaido had moved, not by meters, by kilometers. A tree line doesn't move on its own. It takes years, decades, a relentless, grinding pressure that never stops and never sleeps. When the survey data came back, a wildlife ecologist named Koichi Kaji began documenting what was happening in Hokkaido's interior forest. What he found wasn't dramatic. It was worse than that. It was quiet. Entire hillsides where young trees simply weren't growing back, where the forest floor, which should have been thick with seedlings, was grazed clean, flat, brown, empty. The older trees were still standing, still tall, still impressive from a distance, but they were a facade. Behind them, the next generation of forest had been eaten before it could begin. And when those old trees eventually fell from age, from storm, from disease, there would be nothing waiting to replace them. The forest wasn't dying loudly. It was failing silently, one seedling at a time. But the trees weren't the only thing disappearing. The rivers were changing too. Without deep-rooted vegetation holding the banks together, soil was sliding into the waterway. Streams that had run clear for centuries were turning cloudy with sediment. And that sediment was killing something else entirely: the salmon. Hokkaido's rivers had always been full of them. Salmon that fed bears, eagles, and the soil itself, carrying ocean nutrients deep into the forest every autumn. Now the spawning beds were silting over. The salmon runs were shrinking. And the researchers began to realize they weren't looking at one problem. But here's what nobody expected. When the government finally responded, the solution they chose made everything worse. The government saw the deer number. They saw the forest damage. They saw the data. And they responded the way governments often do when nature produces a problem too large to ignore. They called it a management program. Starting in the late 20th century, Japanese wildlife authorities launched large-scale deer calls across Hokkaido. Hunters were licensed, quotas were set, thousands of deer were removed every year, and for a brief moment, it looked like it was working. Deer numbers dropped. Officials reported progress. Some researchers cautiously agreed. Then the numbers climbed back up. Every time the culling paused, every time budgets tightened or hunting seasons ended, the population rebounded faster than before. Because culling isn't predation. A hunter enters the forest on a schedule. A wolf lives there. A hunter targets the easiest animal to find. A wolf targets the weakest, the sick, the slow, the old, constantly pruning the herd in ways that keep it lean and mobile. A hunter removes deer from the landscape. A wolf changes how deer use the landscape. That difference, that single, fundamental difference, is what the management program missed entirely. The deer still had no reason to fear the forest. They still grazed the same hillsides, still stripped the same riverbanks, still lingered in the same valleys where no predator would ever find them. The damage continued. And it was during this period, somewhere between frustration and desperation, that a small group of ecologists put forward an idea that the Japanese public found deeply uncomfortable. They proposed bringing the wolf back. Not the Ezo wolf. That was gone forever. A different wolf, from a different country. And the reaction to that proposal revealed something about this story that no one had talked about yet. Something that had been buried underneath the science, underneath the ecology, underneath all the data. A fear, old, deep, and surprisingly powerful. The fear wasn't irrational. It was cultural, historical, woven into the way Japan had related to wolves for over 1,000 years. On the mainland, wolves had been blamed for livestock deaths, for attacks on villages, for a kind of creeping dread that farming communities passed down through generations. When the Meiji government poisoned the Ezo wolf, they weren't just solving an agricultural problem. They were finishing something many people already wanted finished. So when ecologists proposed reintroduction, when they stood in front of committees and explained trophic cascades and landscape ecology and predator-prey dynamics, they were met with something no amount of data could easily move: memory. Farmers said no. Rural communities said no. A significant portion of the Japanese public said no. And the wolves didn't come back. They still haven't. What happened instead was slower, less dramatic, but in its own way, more honest about the problem. Researchers began working with local communities to establish protected forest zones, areas where deer hunting was intensified and replanting programs were introduced. In some regions, wire fencing was erected around young saplings, thousands of them, individually protected, one tree at a time. It worked, partially, in places, but the scientists who had spent careers studying Hokkaido's forests knew what they were really doing. They were simulating, imperfectly and expensively, the effect of an animal that used to do it for free. Koichi Kaji, in later interviews, described the situation with the kind of restraint that only comes from decades of watching something you cannot fully fix. He said the forest remembers the wolf even when the wolf is gone. What he meant was this: the entire system, every tree, every river, every salmon run, every hillside stripped bare, was shaped by an absence. Not a disaster, not a plague. Just the removal of one animal that had spent thousands of years making everything else possible. And the lesson, the uncomfortable, inconvenient lesson, isn't really about wolves. It's about what happens when humans decide that one part of a system is the problem without understanding what that part was holding together. We've done it with wolves. We've done it with sharks, with beavers, with large cats. on every continent, in every kind of landscape, and every time the consequences arrive late, quietly, in data sets, in survey maps, in rivers running cloudy where they used to run clear. The forest in Hokkaido is still there, but it is not what it was, and it will not return to what it was within any lifetime currently living. That is the real cost of a decision made in 1889 by men who never imagined they were dismantling something that could not be rebuilt. If that kind of story matters to you, the kind where the truth arrives slowly and lands harder for it, there's more where this came from.